Rick, so good to see you. Here we are in beautiful Newport Beach, lifestyles of the rich and famous, but that's not why we're here today. We're here to talk a little bit about what you're seeing, and let's start macro. The Fed is closing in on hopefully their last interest rate increase, but that remains to be determined. Can you talk a little bit about what you're seeing in the marketplace, especially from a housing perspective, and how the Fed's certainly upcoming rate increase that we all believe is coming?
Yeah, there's probably one more 25 basis point hike in the Fed funds rate. And at that point, we're all hoping that the Fed takes a deep breath, steps back, and waits to see what impact their current model has on inflation. And all of the trends are going in the right direction, maybe not as fast as the Fed would like. But the last inflation report, we were down around 5% year over year. And if you remember, just a few months ago, we were at 8 or 9. So inflation is coming down. If it keeps going down at its current rate, we'd actually be down to the Fed's target of 2% before the end of the year. Now, it may not continue along those lines, but again, we're heading in the right direction. That should give the mortgage market, the finance markets, a chance to settle down a little bit. And just looking at what we're seeing in yields on 10-year U.S. Treasuries, we could see mortgage rates come down by a full point once the market can take out some of the volatility and some of the risk due to what they're concerned about with the Fed. You get down to a 5% mortgage rate, and things feel a whole lot different for home buyers than they do in today's market. And you couple that with a couple other trends we're seeing, which is that home prices across the country have pretty much plateaued or are only rising marginally. In some markets, like here in Newport Beach, are actually going down. And wages continue to go up. So you have that combination of wages increasing, home prices plateauing or declining, and interest rates on mortgages coming down. Affordability starts to feel a whole lot better. And if you get down into the low 5% range in terms of mortgage rates, we might even start to see some people listing their homes. Because if you're at a 4% rate and you've been thinking about selling, going to 5 probably isn't the end of the world. So the market conditions could change pretty dramatically if we do see mortgage rates come down.
So drilling down into those inflation numbers, the Federal Reserve certainly has been focusing on labor.
Yep.
There's been a lot of discussion about the labor inflation not plateauing, but continuing to be a real problem for the overall numbers, as well as some of the other sticky inflation items. What do you see there?
Wage growth is certainly something that the Fed is keeping an eye on. It does contribute to inflation. We've seen the cost of goods, inflation on the cost of goods, come down pretty significantly over the last few reports. One of the areas I'm watching a little bit more closely is energy, which isn't included in all inflation reports. But, you drive down the street here in California, hard to find a gas station selling gas for less than $5 a gallon. That's not necessarily true everywhere in the country, but energy prices are going back up a little bit. That's not likely to change due to what's going on geopolitically. Wage growth is slowing down, and we've seen the number of open jobs dip below 10 million for the first time in several years. We see unemployment numbers actually being a little bit higher than they've been. So as much as that's kind of bad news for your average worker, those are the kind of trends that the Fed is really looking for. And the one thing that is near and dear to our hearts is shelter costs, because that has a lot to do with what's going on in the housing market. We should be getting to a point soon where data on rental rates starts to come down in the Fed's reports. What a lot of people don't realize is housing costs as part of the inflation report tend to lag by almost a full year. I think every economist on the planet, except the ones working for the Fed, take that into account. But rental rates have been either going down or rising at a much lower rate for many months now. They're not being fully reflected in the inflation report. So whatever concerns we might have about other rates going up, I think they'll be offset to a great extent by those housing numbers getting down to where they really should be.
And that's really what we're interested in, right? As experts in the field, we spend a lot of time prognosticating, talking about what's next, this, that, and the other thing. Maybe you could share with folks how folks should look at what the Federal Reserve is doing versus what the Treasury market is predicting is coming down the road. A lot of folks tend to focus on the here and now with the changes that Chairman Powell's making, but the reality is that the Treasury market is way ahead of that. Yeah. And maybe you could talk about how that's going to affect the coming interest rates.
Yeah, if I could give you an accurate forecast on that, Jeff, I would have already written my book. I'd be doing my media tour.
I love it.
Probably by satellite from a small island in the Caribbean. The bond market, the treasuries market, are really looking at a flight to safety right now. We didn't talk about it, but I'm sure one of the factors in the back of people's minds is what's been going on with the banks and the banking industry. So they're looking for safe havens. A lot of the financial advisors are encouraging people to invest in bonds because the yields are relatively high compared to what they normally are, and they're much safer than the volatility we're seeing in the stock market. But the more people that invest in bonds, the lower the yields get, paradoxically. So again, there's a couple things to factor in here. One, as I mentioned earlier, if we just had a normal spread between the yields on 10-year U.S. Treasuries and a 30-year fixed rate loan, mortgage rates would be a full point lower at least. So that's already built into a certain extent. Another is that we've been in a period of an inverted yield curve now for months, and a pretty significant inverted yield curve. And people don't always understand that. A yield curve doesn't cause a recession, but it's a very, very accurate predictor of one. So the bonds market, the treasuries market are definitely predicting a recession that's going to be coming at the end of whatever the Fed activity actually is. So there's a lot of things to consider there. How directly it affects the housing market, really kind of anybody's guess. But if the prediction for a recession is right, that leads to a whole another series of variables. How long is a recession? How severe is it? What's the job loss perspective? And what does that mean for foreclosures and delinquencies and distressed properties? So there's a lot of moving parts, and it's really hard to predict exactly where it goes.
So we've been thinking that the overall Fannie Freddie sort of benchmark loans are going to be back under 6%, hopefully by sometime around Memorial Day. Are trends leading that way, or should we have some concern?
Trends are leading toward conventional loans being back below 6% for that 30-year fixed rate loan. In fact, for 15-year loans, we're already seeing interest rates in the fives. I'm not sure I'm as optimistic as you are in terms of having those rates below 6 by Memorial Day. We've seen a lot of fluctuations, and mortgage rates have kind of bounced around in a pretty tight band between 6.25% and 6.75%. I think we might see a little more of that before we see the rates dip down and settle in the fives. But definitely by Q3, we should be seeing rates in the fives and hopefully in the low fives by the end of the year, which again I think will have both an impact on affordability and an impact on consumer psychology. I think these rates at 6, 6.5, 7, 7.5 have really frightened a lot of people out of the market.
Without a doubt. Certainly as a lender that deals with investors, oftentimes we're focused on the here and now and what the rates are, but the reality is we need the end customer for our folks buying these homes, rehabilitating them, putting the homes back into the marketplace for families to live in. We need those rates to be affordable so that the investor has that home customer back into the marketplace. And that's really what we're looking for.
It goes all up and down the food chain, Jeff. The rates have to be attractive enough for people to want to buy these properties. They have to be attractive enough for the end consumer to want to buy a repaired property. And you know, if you're a buy and hold investor, you're looking to rent out a property, you need rental rates to be going in the right direction and your finance costs to be manageable. So, I mean, if you're looking at the multifamily market as an example, cap rates on multifamily properties are down in the 4s. So if you're looking at buying a property with a 10, 11, 12% interest rate on your financing and your cap rate is 4, that math just doesn't work very well. So the fact is and I'll be talking about this later, but the fact is that we've seen rental rates on multifamily properties continue to go up year over year, but at a slower pace. But we're actually seeing rental rates on single family properties decline.
Interesting.
And it might just be that at that part of the market, we've temporarily reached a saturation point. There's not as much demand, which in turn will drive pricing down.
So this is a good point to transition. Let's talk about the overall housing market, and especially with a focus on investors and what investors are doing today. We've certainly seen a ton of data about folks buying properties. That has certainly tailed off. What are you seeing in the investor marketplace on the single family side?
Yeah, so it appears that a lot of the activity has shifted from fix and flip to buy and hold. And that's probably not a surprise to anybody. Fix and flip investor really wants a market characterized by very low inventory, rapidly rising prices, and strong demand. And demand has been a little bit weaker. Prices, as I said, have plateaued or even going down in some markets. So it's not ideal timing for fix and flip investors. And people that bought a house a year ago that are flipping it now are in a lot of cases, barely breaking even on their investment. So it's a tough time to be a fix and flip investor. And because of that, because of that, we've seen a little bit less buying activity. What's been interesting to me, though, is that the drop-off in buying activity appears to be more at the institutional level than at the individual level. So if you're that local market mom and pop investor who owns a half dozen properties, you know your local market. And we're still seeing a lot of that buying activity going on. But the institutional guys seem to be keeping their powder dry. And that's a fairly common behavior for institutional investors. They look for buying conditions to get optimal, which means prices would drop a little bit further, demand would be a little bit less strong. And I suspect we'll see them coming back stronger in the second half of the year.
So if you're an investor today sitting on the sideline waiting, what are some of the benchmarks that they should be looking for before they should start to feel comfortable that, you know, some of those macro items that we've talked about are coming back into play and looking more favorable for the investor community?
I think I wish I could give you a rule of thumb, but if I'm going to give you any particular insight here, it's you need to know your local market. So I talked about prices plateauing and prices declining in some markets. If you're in coastal California, the Pacific Northwest, Austin, Phoenix, maybe Las Vegas, Boise, Idaho, prices are down 10% year over year. Not ideal conditions. On the other hand, if you're in Florida, if you're anywhere else in Texas except for Austin, if you're in the Carolinas, Tennessee, Alabama, prices are still going up. So conditions for a local market investor in Chattanooga are very different than what they are in Newport Beach. And so there's still opportunities for you as a flipper or as a buy and hold rental property investor. So I don't know that I'd say, wait for interest rates to get to 5.2% because they're probably not going to get that low for investors anytime soon. But you want to look for market stability. And in your market, you want to look probably for two underlying metrics. One is you want to look for job growth, and the other is you want to look for population growth. Because if you're in a market with population growing and jobs growing, you're in a good market for housing, and there will be opportunities to sell homes or to rent homes.
So we have seen trends, and what we've seen on our side of the fence as a lender is those pockets that you've identified that have certainly had declines seem to be more geographically localized than large overall. And that's not always being what's portrayed on the media today.
Right.
How should investors think about that?
Well, look, it would be a stretch to say we're going to have anything resembling a robust housing market this year. I'm forecasting that we'll probably see about 4.4 million existing homes sold, which is down from 5.2 million last year, which is down from 6.2 million the year before. Probably 600,000 new homes sold. And we'd sell more new homes, except the builders aren't going to bring more to market. Multifamily, in the meanwhile, has a record number of apartment units coming to market this year. So the rental market may be a little bit oversupplied in some markets. But what you see in the press tends to be sensationalized one way or the other. We are not going to see the housing market crash from a pricing perspective. Part of the reason for that is inventory is still historically low. everywhere in the country. And you still have pent up demand. So anecdotally, I'm hearing from real estate agents, even in the markets with price declines, as soon as a property comes on the market, if it's priced appropriately, there are multiple bids. And so we're still seeing these properties sell pretty quickly. So I wouldn't be fearful about getting into investment. Again, I want to understand your local market conditions. And to your point, I talk about the Pacific Northwest. Just because prices are going down in Seattle doesn't mean they're going down in Bellevue. Just because they're going down in Boise doesn't mean they're going down in surrounding states or other cities in Idaho. There are markets that just got way overpriced during the boom over the last couple of years that are seeing corrections. And if you know your market, you'll know when to buy during that dip. Because you'll have a decent idea when prices have bottomed out. So you asked earlier what trends you might want to look for as an investor. That would be one. Has your market bottomed out? So if prices were going down, they're down 12%, but now you're starting to see them plateau and maybe even start to edge up a little bit. That might be a sign that it's safe to get back in the water and that the sharks won't be circling.
Interesting. Seasonally overall, the American homeowner typically hits the trail looking for that new home in April, right? It's the spring buying season. Are we seeing that this year, or is it still being held back by the interest rate concerns?
You typically see two trends in the spring buying season, Jeff. You see a lot of inventory come to market because that's when the buyers are thawing out from their winter hibernation, I guess. And if you go back historically, this is all, believe it or not, tied into the school year. And before that, tied into farming cycles.
Okay.
And that's where that seasonality came from. People didn't want to disrupt their kids in the middle of a school year. We're not seeing the typical spring buying season. March activity will probably be up noticeably from February, but February was a terrible month in terms of sales and pricing. My speculation is that the second half of this year will look a lot better than the first half of this year as affordability improves and as people are more inclined to list their properties. So I expect that we're going to have a lackluster typical spring and summer buying season, but that will probably have a little stronger than usual fall and winter buying season.
Interesting.
And keep in mind that right now, a lot of first-time buyers are off the market, millennials, Gen Z folks, because there's not a lot of inventory for them to buy. These are typically households without kids. So if things become more affordable for them in the second half of the year, they're not necessarily going to be as constrained as families with kids in school and be more willing to move. The other trend we're still seeing, talking about moving, is we're still seeing a surprising number of folks moving out of high-cost, high-tax states or markets into lower-cost regions or states. I thought we'd probably gotten through that COVID-induced wave a year or two ago, but just anecdotally, I have an adult son living at home, and he and his girlfriend have been talking about what state they're going to need to move to so they can buy a house. Because the median property in California costs $780,000, and you just can't start there. So I believe there's still a lot of that that's going on, and that will cause lower price markets to see home prices go up a little bit, I guess you'd say artificially, as people from higher priced areas move into those regions.
Yeah, and certainly that's a trend that was exasperated by the COVID period, but at this point, it's interesting to hear that that's still a thing.
Well, look, we're sitting in California today. Last year, on the year, California lost 300,000 people. So 300,000 more people moved out than moved in, and they tended to move out due to the expense of living in California. So New York was second, Illinois was third. On the other hand, you had states like Texas and Florida that had net increases. So some of it's retirement age folks, some of it's folks that are, running a consulting business and can work from anywhere or have the ability to work from home. But I get the feeling this is a trend that is going to be more structural and systemic now than an aberration like we saw during COVID.
So you touched on multifamily, and certainly the multifamily numbers seem to fluctuate, occupancy rise 94 to 98 and anywhere in between. With this large amount of, I assume most of it Class A, coming onto the marketplace, what's the absorption look like for that?
That's the big question facing the industry right now. The belief is that household formation has been constrained over the last couple of years by lack of either owner-occupied or rental property that people can move into. So the notion is that there's a pent-up demand for both rental properties and properties that people can buy. Not a lot of concern that we're going to see vacancy rates skyrocket. And to your point, particularly since the overwhelming majority of stuff coming to market is Class A, and you'll have people kind of moving up into that inventory, maybe rather than buying a house. I've seen reports that as many as 20% of the people who had planned to buy a house this year have decided to rent for a year or two instead, because it's more expensive than they anticipated to finance their purchase, and they need to save more money. So I don't think we're going to see that problem nationally, although I suspect there might be a few markets where you do see an oversupply, at least on a temporary basis. And that might have a downward impact on listing prices for rentals. But we're still at slightly above normal historic levels for occupancy. I think we're at somewhere between 5 and 6% vacancy rates, which is about normal. And for the most part, even though rental prices aren't soaring like they were a year ago, they're not declining, or they're not declining by much. They're going up, but they're going up at more historically normal levels, maybe 2, 3, 4%.
The well-documented housing shortage in the U.S., how much is this creation of Class A apartments going to help put some sort of a dent in that overall deficiency?
Depends on whose numbers you believe. I've seen estimates anywhere from 1.5 to 6 million properties short in terms of homes. I think it's probably closer to the lower end of that than the higher end. But there is no doubt that the builders have underbuilt for the last decade. And they've scaled back on housing starts since interest rates started to go up because people weren't buying. So they didn't want to be sitting with empty inventory on the market. In the short run, having almost 1 million apartment units come to market this year will certainly take a bite out of that lack of supply. But in the long run, it's a stopgap because the majority of these people want to buy. They don't want to rent. And so they'll really only be sort of settling to rent a property, even a really nice property, because they temporarily can't afford to buy. So we still need more inventory coming to market. There's a bill out here in California that's allowing for increased density on existing properties. So you can put an ADU, a little tiny house on your property, and that might also take a little bit of a bite out of lack of inventory. But reality, Jeff, is in a normal market, you want about a 6-month supply of homes available for sale. Nationally today, we're at about 3.5 months. And that's even with demand being a little weaker than it was a few months ago. So we're nowhere near sating the need for homes.
So Rick, talking about the shortage of housing overall in the United States, many folks, especially in the investor community, believe that some of these forbearances and these different programs are going to still be leading to an uptick in foreclosures in wide areas of the country. What data are you seeing? It's funny. Since the pandemic, I've felt very much like a lone voice in the wilderness crying out saying, ain't going to be another foreclosure tsunami. And people thought I was crazy then, and probably still think I'm crazy now. We had 8.5 million people enter the forbearance program. There are less than 300,000 left. Less than 0.5% of the people who've exited the program have defaulted on their loans. So the forbearance program has just been an unmitigated success. Probably the most successful effort I've ever seen between the mortgage industry and the federal government. And it has achieved its goals. And in fact, we're now going to see son of COVID forbearance because Fannie and Freddie, through the FHFA, have now been instructed to create a similar forbearance program. I'll call it COVID Junior.
that will give people outside of a pandemic the opportunity, if they lose their job, to maybe have 6 months or 12 months of forbearance, that those missed payments get tacked on to the end of the loan because this program has been so successful. There's a report coming out that will show that in the first quarter of this year, foreclosure activity was up by double digits over a year ago, but foreclosure activity was still very low a year ago, and that March activity was probably up about 20% from February. But February was the first time in 21 months we saw a year-over-year decline in foreclosure activity. A couple interesting points. One is that foreclosure starts, that first notice a borrower gets, are probably about 80% of where we were back in 2019. So they're getting closer to pre-pandemic numbers. Foreclosure completions are still running at about 30%. So if you're an investor waiting for a bank-owned property to come to market, it's not going to happen in 2023. Even the properties entering foreclosure now will take so long to get through the foreclosure cycle that you won't see that inventory come to market until 2024. And in fact, because of the pandemic moratorium and forbearance programs, on average, it's taking about 1,000 days to execute a foreclosure in the country. Now that'll start to come down as we get to more normal processes. But delinquencies are up slightly, but it's mostly early stage delinquencies. Late stage delinquencies are actually lower than normal. So we're not seeing the kind of groundswell of foreclosure activity that a lot of people anticipated. The one caveat I will give you, going back to talking about what the Federal Reserve is doing and whether or not they'll steer us into a recession. If we do go into a recession, and it's a recession that lasts for a while, and unemployment goes up, let's say, over 6%, we will then start to see an increase in mortgage delinquencies and foreclosures. But right now, if you look at delinquency rates, they're at about 3.9%, and unemployment's about 3.6%. So there's a very strong correlation between those two. And again, most of the predictions, most of the forecasts I'm seeing don't call for huge jumps in unemployment. And because of that, I'm not seeing a likelihood of high numbers of foreclosures either. If you're an investor, your best bet right now is to go work with those borrowers in the early stage of foreclosure, the folks who get that first notice, because 93% of them have positive equity in their homes. So they have an opportunity to sell off that property at a profit, rather than lose all their equity to a foreclosure auction. And you as an investor have an opportunity to negotiate a deal with them that still gets you a property probably below full market value, but allows them to exit gracefully. And also, in that case, you're probably getting a house that's in better condition than if you were waiting for something to go all the way through foreclosure and buy it from the banks.
So that's a great point, which is the tremendous amount of equity that has been created over the incredible run we've had in housing appreciation, really across America, right? Housing appreciation numbers from coast to coast have just been tremendous. How do we think as a country overall that this tremendous amount of equity is going to keep that foreclosure crisis from rearing its ugly head?
Yeah, great question. Equity does not prevent somebody from going into foreclosure. So you lose a job, you don't get a new one for a few months. Most people don't have a lot of cash reserves. They wind up missing a couple mortgage payments. They wind up in foreclosure. But having equity gives them an opportunity to execute a soft landing and get out of foreclosure before that auction takes place. If there are roughly 270,000 people in foreclosure right now, over 100,000 of them have more than 20% equity. Another 60,000 have more than 50% equity, and another 25,000 have more than 75% equity. None of these people should ever be foreclosed on. They should be able to find a way out. And for those people, particularly the ones with the high equity numbers, if they find a new job, these are people that a mortgage servicer might actually be willing to consider a refinance because now they have income coming in and they were good credit risk before they lost their job. So they can tap into that equity to give the lender a little bit of a cushion, a little bit of a sense of security that they should be able to work with these folks. So that's how this is going to help prevent more foreclosures. And we're seeing it in the numbers, Jeff. We're seeing a much higher percentage of homes in that first stage of foreclosure sell prior to the auction than we saw prior to the pandemic. and it's just an indication that people are leveraging equity in a way that's really intelligent.
So thinking about those equity numbers, the run up in housing appreciation over the last, let's say, three years, are the marketplaces that we've identified, the Boise, the Austin, are those the markets that have the housing appreciating numbers and are coming back to mean now, or what are we looking at there?
So I was talking to Lawrence Yun from the NAR about recession and what might happen and housing prices going down. And he said, not to be cavalier, but he said, if you're in Phoenix and your property has gone up in value 50% in the last 2 years, is a 10% reduction really that big of a deal? Is it a catastrophe? And I think there's some wisdom there. We are seeing prices go down in some of the markets that were overheated. So yeah, Boise went up 47% in 1 year. A 10% price reduction isn't a big deal. There are pockets of borrowers where I'm a little bit concerned. So if you go back to somebody who bought a property at the peak back in 2022, and they were an FHA borrower, so they had a 3.5% interest rate or 3.5% down payment on their loan, and they happen to be in a market where prices have gone down 5%. Well, suddenly they're underwater on their loan. Now, being underwater doesn't mean you're going to go into foreclosure, but it means if you do go into foreclosure, you're going to have a harder time getting out. So I'm not concerned holistically, because when you really start doing the math, FHA borrowers last year were maybe 11% of the total. What percentage of them had 3.5% down payment loans? What percentage of them bought at the peak? What percentage of them are in markets where prices went down? You start getting down to a fairly small number. And in a normal market, we would have today about 530,000 people in foreclosure. That's just the normal range. And we have about 270,000. So we have a long way to go. A lot of slack before we even got back to historically normal levels of foreclosures. So I'm not really concerned about that getting out of control or having a material effect on home prices.